Right, well, let's dive straight in. What's the first tip you've got for us today?
Okay, so my first tip, which is now I'm getting really interested at the moment about, is around being open to increasing wait times after you ask a question. I look back on my early practice. I think that's probably why I find it a bit interesting is I hated awkward silences. Whenever I was observed, always thought good practice looked really dynamic, back and forth, and partly, I think, like a lot, I guess, in education, got involved to try and help students, so therefore rushed to help them when they were struggling, when there was a long silence. And yet the research that I've been reading around wait times, I think, is really fascinating. And I think the reason this is kind of my first tip is to consider increasing the wait times is I feel like as a community, we're getting really good at understanding the benefits of retrieval practice. And you have to convince people about what retrieval practice is or why it helps. We're now kind of getting into the nuance of how do we maximise it. And I think wait times is going to be very closely linked to that because we don't want to short circuit that retrieval practice process.
Wow, this is fascinating. I love this. Exactly the same as you. I was terrible in my early teaching career at that wait time, just diving in straight away. I was scared of silence as well. What have you been reading on this, Bradley? What's the research on this? I've certainly not come across this myself.
So there's actually quite a bit of research, but quite weirdly, and I don't know if it's going to change, it seems to be fairly old research, which I don't necessarily think is a problem, but there haven't been an abundance of recent studies. Basically I spent about 3 days just trying to find a paper that could give me the answer of what is the perfect wait time. So then I could just go and say, it's 7.3 seconds and we'll all be happy. No research paper exists. I think it depends on too many factors. What they did find was the average wait time that teachers tend to wait after they ask a question. And it seems to be between about 0.7 and 1.4 seconds is the benchmark. They said a number of teachers, and we've had teachers tell us this, wait like 0.2 or 0.3 seconds when you actually time it. And the reason I love that, because I kind of come from a sport background, is Usain Bolt's reaction time in the 100 metres is 0.2 seconds. So it kind of gives an indication of if we really want students to retrieve hard, is 0.2 seconds going to be their best answer or just the first answer? And then I found one study, I should kind of make clear, it wasn't saying this is the optimal, but they looked at a threshold of 3 seconds. And what they found is after 3 seconds, both the quality and quantity of answers increased. And I think sometimes, looking back at my career and what we've heard other teachers say is, we don't want to increase wait times too much because you don't want the quickest to get bored, is sometimes what you hear. But I don't think 3 seconds, I think it's enough of a window, as an example, that extends the opportunity for everyone without demotivating the quickest as well. So it's not saying 3 seconds is the ideal, but it gives an indication of it's worth considering how long we leave, I think is what I took from that study.
It's really interesting you say this. I think I remember Dylan William when I went to hear him give a talk. He was citing similar research, and the other interesting thing he said was that teachers always overestimate how much time they are giving. So if you ask teachers, they'll say, oh yeah, I'll wait 5 seconds, 6 seconds, but then when you actually measure it and it's 0.2 or whatever, it's quite a shock, isn't it? As teachers, we can be quite easily fooled just generally, can't we?
And I'll tell you what I felt. I felt that count double when everyone had to do online teaching.
Yes.
When you can't even pick up like any non-verbal cues, and you ask a question, you don't know, are they sitting there thinking, I'm thinking really hard about this and I'm right on the edge of getting it, or are they really bored? So we tend to, I think everyone has this sort of negativity bias, we tend to assume the worst, and so therefore I should move on quickly. I think generally speaking people are quite poor at that self-estimation of how long we actually leave.
That's really interesting. I'll tell you the other thing, talking about online teaching. So I've been doing a lot of online kind of courses over the last couple of years, running them. And there's a lot of things that are very, very bad about running online courses versus being there in person. But one of the things I found worse is knowing how long to give teachers to either work on a task or think about an answer or discuss and so on. Whereas when you're in person, obviously you can get a bit of a sense from the room, when people are ready. Whereas online, the only way I've found to do it is I put a little question up saying, click yes when you're ready to move on. And the problem I have with that is, let's say I've got 50 people online. As soon as I see about 2 or 3 who've clicked yes, I start getting anxious, thinking, oh God, I best start moving on here. And it's the reason I say that is reminds me of what you just said there, where as a teacher, I always have kind of the kind of fastest kid in mind, if that makes sense. And I think, well, as soon as somebody's ready, I best start getting the ball rolling. Whereas the other 90% of kids or whatever, they may need those extra few seconds, just like the other 90% of teachers during online workshops. They will probably appreciate it. But we're always kind of in a rush, aren't we, to kind of satisfy the 1 or 2 who are ready to move on, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. And the other thing that where I kind of see that similar is if we rush and someone gets the answer right, we don't know if they've got it right because they just guessed because they felt under pressure to come up with an answer and they just guessed anything, or if they actually really know the content. And that's actually really problematic if we're talking about checking for understanding and misconceptions. If I assume that you know this because you got the answer right, whereas actually you just got lucky because you felt under pressure to blurt something out, that can hinder the learning process as well. So yeah, it's interesting how it's aimed for the quickest, and yet it can lead to either sloppy mistakes or, in fact, blind guessing, which is still problematic, I think.
Yeah, this is fascinating. The other thing I love that you said there, Bradley, as well, is the fact that the research into retrieval is so ubiquitous now and has made its way into classrooms. And now it's the time to start thinking about the nuances. I'd never tied the two together before, the notion of wait time and the power of retrieval, and the fact that if we give students longer to think, they're accessing long-term memory, they're making more connections than if we try and drive it forward at a quicker pace. That's fascinating, that, Bradley.
So the way a colleague described it to me is essentially, on a basic level, everyone's brain works at different speed, and so therefore if we short-circuit the wait time, only the quickest have done successful retrieval practice, which means because of the Matthew effect, that the more you know, the easier it is to learn new information, the gap just gets wider then, because those who probably need it the most haven't had that successful retrieval. And so now for me, the two are inextricably linked, because I want everyone doing retrieval practice successfully, ideally, but short wait times don't facilitate that.
This is fascinating. So I guess the big question here, because it's interesting, when I first started my voyage through the research, I was getting so mad that there just wasn't clear answers to all my questions. Same. So if we don't have it with wait time, we don't have this optimal, which makes sense, right? Of course, it's going to depend on so many different factors. I guess the big question, Bradley, is how as teachers do we know how much wait time to give? Is there anything there that we can do? Any signs, any indications, any kind of benchmarks?
I mean, I guess for me, I was at first frustrated that there was no clean answer, and then I've actually now come to at peace with it, in terms of maybe that's the role of research. Is at best it just kind of informs and it gives guidelines, and it should never replace teacher judgment. It's always going to come down to an individual judgment call. I have heard some teachers, when we speak to them about it, say the type of question makes a difference in terms of if it's factual or if it's kind of a higher order one. Just the practicalities of, how much content do we need to get through? Because we can all sit here and say in an ideal world we should leave long wait times, but if there is real world pressure to get through a heavy curriculum, you do have to factor that in. I think how much stuff do the students already know makes a difference. Probably why you're asking the question. And so no, I don't think, I would love that. I wish I could come up with a neat formula. And I don't think there is. I think it's worth the discussion around how long do I leave and what factors do I consider, and those might be some of them. And that's kind of why I was quite keen on the way I kind of worded the first tip to you wasn't increase wait times or to give a long wait time. It's just important to consider and reflect how long you leave and why you leave them. And I think that's what research should be about, is driving that self-reflection as opposed to here's a neat answer necessarily. That's
really good. And final thing just on this tip, I'm always a big fan of kind of research best bets, because again, we don't have these definitive answers, but there are certain kind of best bets from research that might come out. I'll try and push you on this, Bradley. Would you go so far as to say, just in general, obviously there's going to be exceptions, but as teachers, that perhaps if we ask a question, when our instinct is to then, call upon the students to give our answer, it might be a good idea just to hold fire for a couple more seconds than perhaps our instincts is. Certainly for less experienced teachers, that might be a smart move. Or is that too broad a generalisation?
No, I think that's fine. I think I think the potential gains outweigh the potential losses in that. So, like, as a rule of thumb, going a bit slower than you think is probably a really healthy starting point.
Love it.